The Vanishing Cabin. Sarah, Tom, and Jenny had been friends since college, and every year, they made it a tradition to go on a summer trip together. This year, they decided on a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, hoping for a quiet retreat from their hectic lives. The cabin was isolated, miles away from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough, winding dirt road. The drive was long and arduous, but the scenery was breathtaking. Towering trees lined the road, their dense foliage creating a canopy that blocked out the sun. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk was settling in, casting a warm, golden hue over everything. The cabin itself was rustic but charming, with a large front porch and a stone fireplace. After unpacking and settling in, they decided to explore the surrounding woods before nightfall. They found a narrow path leading deeper into the forest, and as they walked, the light filtering through the trees grew dimmer. After about half an hour, they came across an old, abandoned campsite. The remains of a fire pit, a rusted tin kettle, and a torn tent were all that was left. "Looks like someone left in a hurry," Tom remarked, nudging the torn tent with his foot. "Or never came back," Jenny added with a nervous laugh. A sudden chill ran down Sarah's spine, but she brushed it off. "Let's head back before it gets too dark." As they made their way back to the cabin, the woods seemed to grow denser, the shadows longer. They reached the cabin just as the last light of day disappeared, plunging the area into darkness. Inside, they lit a fire and sat around, chatting and reminiscing about their college days. Later that night, Sarah woke to a strange sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. She listened intently, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed to be coming from outside the cabin. She glanced at the clock, 3:15 a.m. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tiptoed to the window and peeked out. In the faint moonlight, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the shadows. The figure stood perfectly still, its gaze fixed on the cabin. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to wake Tom and Jenny, but she was frozen with fear. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Sarah forced herself to turn away from the window and wake her friends. They groggily followed her to the window, but when they looked out, the figure was gone. The tapping had stopped. "You're just imagining things," Tom said, though his voice wavered. "Let's try to get some sleep." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed, but sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake, listening for any sound, any sign of the mysterious figure. The next day, they decided to stay close to the cabin. They spent the morning exploring the immediate area, but an uneasy feeling hung over them. By afternoon, storm clouds gathered, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The storm hit hard, lashing the cabin with rain and lightning. That night, the power went out. They lit candles and huddled together in the living room, the flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The tapping started again, louder and more persistent than before. It seemed to come from all around the cabin, as if the figure was circling it. "Who could be out there in this storm?" Jenny whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but we need to find out," Tom said, grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here. I'll go check it out." "No, we stick together," Sarah insisted. They ventured outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the rain and darkness. They circled the cabin, finding nothing but the storm's fury. As they returned to the front porch, they saw it, the figure standing closer this time, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. "Who's there?" Tom shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. Suddenly, the cabin door slammed shut behind them. They rushed back inside, but something felt different. The air was colder, the shadows darker. They realized with growing horror that the cabin wasn't the same. The furniture was old and decayed, the walls covered in a thick layer of dust. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. They scrambled to gather their belongings, but as they did, the tapping resumed, now inside the cabin. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, closing in on them. Desperate, they ran for the door, only to find it locked, the keyhole filled with rust. The figure appeared in the doorway, its face now visible in the dim light. It was a hollow, skeletal visage with empty eye sockets that seemed to bore into their souls. It raised a bony hand and pointed at them, a silent command to stay. The friends huddled together, their fear palpable. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, the cabin around them seemed to dissolve into darkness. The last thing Sarah saw before everything went black was the figure's empty eyes, pulling them into a void of terror. When they awoke, they were back in their car, parked on the side of the dirt road leading to the cabin. It was morning, and the storm had passed. The cabin was gone, replaced by an overgrown clearing. No trace of it remained, not even the path they had taken the day before. They drove away in silence, each lost in their thoughts, the memory of the vanishing cabin haunting them. They never spoke of the trip again, but each of them was plagued by nightmares of the skeletal figure and its hollow eyes, forever watching, forever waiting. Whispers in the woods. It was late October when I decided to go camping with my two friends, Mark and Lisa. We had been talking about this trip for months, planning every detail meticulously. We chose a remote spot deep within the dense woods of the old Pine Creek forest, a place known for its untouched beauty and eerie silence. As we set up camp, the sun began its descent, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and whisper among the trees. We pitched our tents near a small, murky pond that reflected the blood-red sky. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Night fell quickly, enveloping us in darkness. We gathered around the campfire, its flickering flames casting ominous shapes on the surrounding trees. Mark told a few ghost stories, but Lisa and I laughed them off, attributing the chills running down our spines to the cold night air. As the hours passed, a thick fog rolled in, snuffing out the light from the moon and stars. The forest seemed to close in around us, and the once calming silence now felt oppressive. We decided it was time to sleep. I crawled into my tent and zipped up the entrance, trying to shake off a growing sense of unease. The sounds of the night crept in, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I tried to convince myself that it was just wildlife, but a gnawing fear had taken hold. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, and unsteady. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear Mark and Lisa stirring in their tents as well. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent flap. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps move away and a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably malicious. I forced myself to believe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When dawn finally broke, we emerged from our tents, tired and on edge. We didn't speak of the footsteps or the whispers, but I could see the fear in Mark and Lisa's eyes. We decided to pack up and leave, feeling that the beauty of Pine Creek Forest wasn't worth the growing terror in our hearts. As we dismantled the camp, I noticed something strange. Around the pond where we had camped, the ground was littered with small wooden carvings, primitive figures with grotesque, contorted faces. They hadn't been there the day before. We hastened our pace, eager to be gone. As we walked back along the narrow, winding trail, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, an indistinct shape that would disappear as soon as I turned to look. We finally reached the edge of the forest and piled into Mark's car. As we drove away, I glanced back at the dark, brooding woods. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, I saw a figure standing motionless, watching us. It was tall and thin, with eyes that glowed faintly in the morning light. We never spoke of that night again. We never returned to Pine Creek Forest. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear those footsteps and the whispers, growing louder, as if they are slowly but surely finding their way back to me.